A human head can retain awareness for a brief period after decapitation, a horrifying interval in which the eyes may blink, the lips move, and consciousness flickers as life fades. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, and perhaps history's most notorious executed queen, this grim possibility was only part of the ordeal she faced. Contemporary accounts often sanitize the events of her final moments, but the reality reveals a psychological torment far more calculated than the stroke of an executioner's sword. Her death was not simply an ending. It was a deliberate performance meant to destroy her dignity, tarnish her legacy, and serve as a cautionary example. By May 19, 1536, Anne had spent 17 days confined within the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once prepared to be crowned. Henry VIII deliberately extended her uncertainty, heightening her mental suffering with repeated delays. In a striking twist, he had a skilled swordsman brought from Calais to perform the execution, a detail often framed as mercy, but in truth, emphasizing the theatrical nature of her death. During her final hours, Anne reportedly displayed an unsettling composure, even moments of cheer, which modern psychologists would identify as dissociation, a defense mechanism in response to extreme trauma. She reportedly joked with her attendants that she would be known as the Headless Anne, a dark humor that hid her fear. Anne's torment went beyond the physical. Her reputation was systematically dismantled. She faced accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to kill the king, charges so implausible they would fail in any modern court. Henry VIII sought not just her death, but the erasure of her influence, the undermining of her daughter Elizabeth's legitimacy, and a public warning that no one, particularly women, could defy the king without peril. In the days before her execution, Anne was forced to hear lurid, fabricated tales of her alleged immorality. On the morning of May 19th, London's bright sunlight contrasted sharply with the grim events unfolding inside the tower. She had spent the night in prayer, often unable to sleep, and at 2 a.m. had requested the sacrament, kneeling for hours in devout communion. By dawn, she had been awake nearly 24 hours, her mind fraying under exhaustion and constant stress. Witnesses later recounted that when the tower officials came for her, she appeared to be laughing with her ladies, a haunting display of gallows humor, concealing the immense psychological strain she endured. Her execution had been repeatedly delayed, each postponement a form of psychological torture. When the hour arrived, Anne was led through the same corridors where she had once paraded as queen, now flanked by guards to prevent escape. Courtiers who had once bowed before her watched with calculated indifference. The scaffold on Tower Green was deliberately low, barely 3 feet high, forcing her to ascend only a few steps and keeping her close to the jeering crowd, which had been encouraged to treat the execution as public spectacle. The scene was designed to humiliate, warning others against defying the king, particularly ambitious women. Before kneeling at the block, Anne delivered a final statement, permitted not out of mercy, but due to tradition. She spoke with composed dignity. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Though seemingly submissive, her words were a subtle act of defiance. By acknowledging the law without admitting guilt, she quietly challenged the legitimacy of the charges against her, asserting her integrity one last time before the executioner's blade fell. Perhaps most unsettling was the king's absence. Unlike the public spectacle of royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend, remaining at Whitehall Palace to await news of Anne's death. As the sword fell, he was reportedly focused on celebrating his forthcoming marriage to Jane Seymour, a grim indication of how completely Anne had been discarded. Her death had become a political necessity, a brutal step towards securing a male heir. The swordsman from Calais, specially requested and paid handsomely for his skill, added another layer of calculated cruelty. Traditional English executions used an axe, often requiring several strikes, but the French swordsman could decapitate in a single blow, a technique unfamiliar to Anne, leaving her to face a stranger in her final moments, a final indignity for a former queen who once commanded all England's attention. The blindfold, often portrayed as an act of mercy, actually served a practical purpose. It prevented her from flinching at the crucial moment, which could have led to a botched execution. Anne knelt upright, rather than placing her head on a block, following another French custom, forcing her to remain still and composed as the executioner prepared his strike. Witnesses described her lips moving in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold as she strained to perceive any sound of the approaching blade. This psychological torment, knowing death was imminent but uncertain, represents a form of cruelty often omitted in sanitized histories. The decapitation itself was remarkably clean by Tudor standards, a single stroke severing her head. Yet, even after death, her body betrayed horrifying signs of life. Her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds, a physiological reaction, as oxygen lingered in the brain. Some accounts suggest her lips even formed words, completing the prayers interrupted by the sword. The scene was so distressing that some witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror, confronted with the fragile boundary between body and soul. No proper coffin had been prepared for Anne. Her ladies-in-waiting, overcome by grief and shock, scrambled to find an arrow chest to hold her head and body, a detail that underscores the complete disregard for her dignity. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel, without formal Christian rites, as though her memory should vanish as quickly as her life. Henry's campaign to erase her extended beyond death. Her portraits were destroyed, royal emblems chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers quickly learned that even mentioning her name could bring royal disfavor. This systematic obliteration sought to erase not only the woman, but her very existence and legacy. The trauma of her execution also deeply affected those who witnessed it, particularly her ladies-in-waiting, who were forced to clean and prepare her severed head. Fearful for their own safety, they performed these grim tasks while maintaining composure, and several suffered nightmares for years afterward. At least one eventually entered a convent, unable to continue life at court. The ripple effects of this psychological terror permeated Henry's court, instilling fear for the remainder of his reign. In the immediate aftermath, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from succession. The child, who would one day become one of England's greatest queens, was left effectively orphaned, her mother executed, and her father publicly denying her legitimacy. Elizabeth's household was dissolved almost overnight, her clothing and attendants stripped of the status appropriate to her birth. Even a toddler was not spared the cruelty wrought by Henry's political machinations. Modern portrayals of Tudor executions rarely capture the full sensory horror. The scaffold reeked of blood from previous executions, swarming with flies in the May warmth. The crowd's roar, manipulated by planted supporters cheering the Queen's death, created a disorienting wall of sound. As Anne approached Tower Green, the jeers, catcalls, and orchestrated shouts intensified, reinforcing the public's perception of her as a witch and adulteress, amplifying the terror of her final moments. This public spectacle of humiliation was central to Tudor justice, where death alone was never deemed sufficient punishment. Popular retellings often romanticize Anne's final speech as a poised act of defiance, yet historical accounts suggest a far more constrained reality. Her carefully crafted words, praising the king as a gracious sovereign, reveal the impossible position she occupied. Even on the brink of death, Anne could not speak freely. Her statements were dictated by concern for her daughter's future and the reaction of the watching crowd. Rather than freedom, her speech represents a form of ultimate censorship, the final control imposed over a woman whose every word would be scrutinized by the king and remembered by the court. The sword that claimed her life, imported from France, underscores the theatricality of the execution. Henry spared no expense to ensure a spectacle befitting a queen's downfall. The executioner reportedly practiced on animals to perfect a clean single stroke, transforming Anne's death into a precise technical display. This professional detachment reduced her final moments to a mechanical procedure, exemplifying the dehumanization inherent in state-sanctioned executions. Contemporary sources note that English executioners refused the task, not out of conscience, but because the French sword required specialized skill. Its design, a razor-sharp blade weighted for a swift downward strike, contrasted sharply with the English axe, highlighting the calculated performance aspect of her death. After the sword fell, Thomas Wyatt, imprisoned in the Tower, and once an admirer of Anne, wrote of the little throat that had worn so many jewels, capturing her grotesque transformation from queen to objectified corpse. Her head was lifted by the executioner, a traditional gesture signaling the sentence's completion. Before her, weeping ladies wrapped it in linen. This display, with blood still flowing from severed arteries, created a stark visual that seared itself into witness memories. Tower records indicate that Anne's burial was rushed, her Christian rites abbreviated. Placed in an arrow chest beneath the chapel floor among other executed nobles, her grave remained unmarked, a stark erasure of even her final resting place. This act completed Henry's campaign to remove Anne from life and history, a purge that nearly succeeded. In the aftermath, Henry's propagandists worked swiftly to shape the narrative. Court poets who had once celebrated her wit and beauty now depicted her as a scheming adulteress. Official accounts framed the use of a skilled French swordsman as an act of mercy, recasting the king's calculated theatrics as compassion. The horror of her execution was systematically sanitized in records, beginning centuries of historical revision that continue to color our understanding of Anne's death. Perhaps most chilling is how quickly Henry resumed normal life. The day after Anne's execution, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour, and within 2 weeks, he married her in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This rapid transition reveals the execution as a politically convenient solution. Anne failed to provide a male heir, and her elimination facilitated dynastic aims. The personal tragedy of her death was entirely subordinated to statecraft. The psychological torment began long before the scaffold. For weeks, Anne endured relentless interrogation, sleep deprivation, and isolation from allies. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, employed methods strikingly similar to modern psychological manipulation, disorientation, forced misinformation, and strategic intimidation. By the time she reached the scaffold, Anne had already been subjected to an extended campaign designed to break her mind, ensuring she would offer no final resistance that might challenge the king or the narrative of her demise. Court documents reveal that the security surrounding Anne's execution exceeded the usual measures, even for high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and extra guards were stationed throughout the fortress, not to prevent escape, but to stop any last-minute attempts by her supporters to interfere or sway public opinion. The overwhelming presence of armed men also served to intimidate anyone who might sympathize with Anne, enforcing compliance through fear. The execution was scheduled for mid-morning rather than at dawn, ensuring maximum attendance by Londoners. While Tower Green could only hold a limited number of nobles and officials, its height allowed the public outside to hear announcements of the execution, and church bells across the city marked the moment of her death, broadcasting royal authority throughout London. In this way, Anne's private suffering was transformed into a public spectacle. Death as theatre rather than tragedy. An often overlooked element is the fate of her co-accused. 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn, were executed just days earlier on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths preemptively established the official narrative of Anne's crimes, preventing any final testimony that could contradict it. This coordinated elimination of 6 individuals, all convicted on fabricated evidence, stands as one of Tudor England's most audacious exercises in state violence, a purge reminiscent of show trials centuries later. Though a memorial now marks the approximate site of Anne's execution, contemporary records suggest the scaffold actually stood elsewhere in the Tower complex. This geographic uncertainty mirrors the ways her death has been repeatedly reframed over time, both physically and historically, to suit different narratives. The romanticized versions in popular culture bear little resemblance to the psychological torment, character assassination, and orchestrated cruelty that defined her final days in May 1536. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not merely in the beheading itself, but in seeing it as the climax of a systematic effort to erase a woman who had become too influential for Tudor society's comfort. She was not just executed, she was methodically unmade. Her reputation was obliterated, her achievements nullified, and her existence nearly erased from history. Looking at her final days in full, the psychological torture, public humiliation, performative execution, and attempted erasure of her memory reveal a terror far more profound than the single stroke of a sword. From a modern psychological lens, Anne's ordeal is a case study in state-sanctioned gaslighting and character assassination. The charges against her, adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, and conspiring to poison the king, would be laughable in any contemporary court. Yet, through manipulation of public perception, forced confessions from co-accused men, and control over official accounts, Henry's government convinced many that Anne deserved her fate. This distortion of reality remains perhaps the most chilling aspect of her story. Even 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn's execution continues to captivate, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of personal tragedy and political calculation. Her death was not merely the end of a life, it was a meticulously orchestrated performance meant to justify a king's actions and reshape collective memory. The true horror lies not in the moment the sword fell, but in witnessing how absolute power can rewrite reality, a lesson that resonates sharply in an age of information manipulation and character assassination. Despite Henry's relentless efforts to erase her, it was her death, rather than her life, that became her most enduring legacy. Examining Anne's execution in its full psychological and political context offers sobering insights into power, gender, and historical narrative. The severed head of a queen becomes a stark warning of how truth itself can be fragile when confronted with authority unchecked.